Thugs had a go at an old war hero in front of the Royal Guard, thinking nobody would help. But the Royal Guard's quick and firm action made them regret it badly. The sun was high above the royal palace, its gold light bouncing off the white walls and shiny towers. The palace grounds were busy. Tourists walked around the stone paths, taking pictures of the amazing buildings. Children were laughing and running, their parents pointing at the huge gates, the entrance to one of the country's most famous places. Among the visitors, the Royal Guard stood strong and well-behaved, their red jackets and tall black hats shining in the sun. They were symbols of lasting tradition and honor. To someone who didn't know, they looked still, like stone statues. But their keen eyes saw everything, checking the crowds for any sign of trouble. By the main gate stood Michael Davies, an experienced guard who had spent over 10 years in this job. He stood perfectly straight, his white-gloved hands on the shiny rifle over his shoulder. Davies's face was calm, showing no emotion, even with the loud chatter and the cameras flashing around him. This was his job, to show the strength and dignity of the Royal Guard, to be a steady guard no matter what happened around him. But today, something felt wrong. Davies's sharp senses, developed through years of training, noticed a small problem in the air. His eyes moved to a small group near the palace gates. 4 men were hanging around at the edge of the crowd, their movements not matching the usual tourists. They leaned against a low stone wall, their heads close together, muttering. They wore untidy clothes, hooded tops, worn-out trainers, and old jeans. But it was their attitude that worried Davies. They weren't looking at the palace or the guards. Their eyes were on one person, an old man standing not far from the gate. He was bent over, using a wooden walking stick. He was dressed smartly, his jacket ironed and his shoes polished. But it was the medals on his chest that got the most attention. The old soldier's jacket had a row of shiny awards, their gold and silver catching the sunlight with every small move he made. Even though his back was bent and his steps were slow, he had a quiet dignity. He demanded respect, at least from those who understood what those medals meant. Davies recognized the medals straight away. They were for bravery, given only to those who had served their country with great honor. His respect for the man grew hugely at that moment, but the group of men didn't seem to feel the same. Davies's grip on his rifle tightened slightly as he watched one of the men point at the old soldier, nudging his friend with his elbow and laughing. The group started to move closer, their voices low but with a hint of anger. Davies's jaw tightened. He had to follow rules. He couldn't act unless there was a clear threat. But something about the scene made him very nervous. He looked at the old soldier again, who seemed not to notice the men's attention as he adjusted his medals with a shaking hand. The tension was obvious, pulling at Davies's instincts. Today would not be like other days. The air around the palace seemed to change as the group of men got closer to the old war hero, their laughter heard above the noise of the tourist crowd. It was harsh and mean, a big contrast to the calm feeling that usually covered the royal grounds. Michael Davies's sharp eyes stayed on the group, his instincts telling him this wasn't just innocent. The old soldier, not noticing them coming, stopped near the edge of the stone path. He adjusted his walking stick, leaning on it heavily, and took a moment to look at the huge gates of the palace. The sunlight shone off the medals on his jacket, each one showing a time of service and sacrifice. For a short time, the old soldier seemed lost in thought, maybe remembering when he was younger, standing tall in uniform. But his quiet moment was broken. "Hey, old man," one of the thugs shouted, his voice full of mockery. The old soldier turned slowly, his face calm but tired. The group surrounded him, looking casual but with bad intentions. "Are those medals real?" The tallest of the group sneered, leaning in close so that the old soldier stepped back. "Or did you get them from a cheap shop?" The old soldier stood straighter, his voice steady despite the shake in his hands. "They're real," he said firmly. "I earned them serving my country." The tallest thug laughed loudly, nudging his friends. "Serving your country, huh? I bet you just worked in an office." The other men chuckled, encouraged by their leader's taunts. One of them, a skinny man with a smirk, leaned forward and flicked one of the medals with his finger. "Doesn't look like much to me," he jeered. "Don't. Touch those," the old soldier said quietly, his hand moving to protect the medals. There was no anger in his voice, only a quiet plea for respect. But the group wasn't interested in respect. They wanted a reaction. Davies's jaw tightened as he watched. His fingers wanted to move, to step forward and stop the bullying. But his training stopped him. Royal Guards were not to get involved unless there was a clear threat to the palace or its visitors. Acting without a good reason could lead to serious trouble. And yet, Davies couldn't look away. The tension got worse as the leader stepped closer, his big frame much bigger than the old soldier. "What's wrong, Grandad?" he teased. "Don't like us looking at your little toys? I bet they're worth a lot. Maybe I should take one as a souvenir." The old soldier's hand tightened on his stick, his lips pressed together. "You won't do that," he said, his voice low and steady. There was no fear in his words, only determination. The thug smirked, looking back, at his friends as if to say, "Watch this." Suddenly he pushed the old soldier's shoulder. The older man stumbled, his stick slipping on the uneven stones. He stopped himself from falling, but it made nearby tourists gasp. Several people stopped, their faces changing from confusion to worry. A woman near the gate paused, her phone in her hand, as if deciding whether to help or call for help. Another man whispered to his friend, pointing at what was happening. The crowd's murmurs got louder, their worry clear. Davies's heart was beating fast. The old soldier was clearly weak, and the group was getting bolder. He had spent years learning to control himself, following rules no matter how hard it was. But at this moment, standing still felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in. The leader pushed the old soldier again, harder this time, making him stumble back. "Let me see one of those medals," he demanded, reaching out to grab the man's jacket. That was the breaking point. Davies's body moved before his mind could catch up. He stepped forward, breaking his stiff pose, and his polished boots hit the stones with purpose. A few tourists gasped, their cameras pointing at him as the unbelievable happened. A royal guard was moving. "Step away from him," Davies ordered, his voice sharp and firm. The group froze, surprised by the sudden appearance of the guard. The leader turned, his sneer fading for a moment before he got it back. "Are you talking to us?" he asked, his tone full of fake defiance. "I said, step away," Davies repeated, his eyes fixed on the leader. His pose was still perfect, his rifle steady at his side, but there was a quiet power in his look that made it clear he wasn't asking. The crowd went silent, their attention on what was happening. The air seemed to hold its breath, the weight of the moment on everyone. The leader looked at his friends, then back at Davies. "Or what?" he challenged, taking a step forward. "You're going to arrest us, soldier boy. Where's the rest of your little statue friends?" Davies didn't move. His voice stayed calm, but with steel in his tone. "I don't need backup to deal with you." The quiet authority in his words made the group uncertain. For the first time, the leader hesitated, his confidence breaking under Davies's strong presence. Behind him, the old soldier stood as straight as he could. Relief and thanks flickered in his eyes as he watched the guard stand between him and the men who had tried to humiliate him. Things were about to change. The silence in the courtyard was heavy, broken only by the wind and the whispers of tourists watching from a safe distance. Michael Davies stood firm, his tall frame and disciplined pose showing an authority that demanded respect. But the thugs weren't giving up, not yet. The leader of the group, a big man with a shaved head and a scar across his forehead, stepped forward, his lips curled into a sneer as he looked at the royal guard. "Look at this guy," he said, turning to his friends with a mocking laugh. "Thinks he's a big hero or something." Davies's eyes stayed on the leader, not moving. "This is your last warning," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. "Leave the grounds and let the man go now." The leader took another step closer, his swagger meant to scare. "And if we don't?" he challenged, his tone full of defiance. "What are you going to do about it? Stand there and stare us to death?" The tension in the air was thick, and the crowd seemed to hold its breath. Some tourists had their phones up, recording what was happening, while others whispered nervously to each other. The old war hero stood a few steps behind Davies, his hand gripping his stick tightly, his face showing worry and thanks. One of the thugs, a skinny man with nervous energy, nudged the leader. "Let's just go, man. This isn't worth it." But the leader ignored him. His pride had been hurt, and he wasn't going to back down in front of everyone. With a sudden burst of anger, he lunged at the old soldier, his hand reaching out to grab one of the medals. The move was quick, but Davies was faster. In one smooth movement, the royal guard stepped between the thug and the old soldier, his white-gloved hand catching the man's wrist mid-air. The force of the stop sent a sharp jolt through the thug's arm, and he winced, trying to pull free. But Davies's grip was firm. "Not going to happen," Davies said, his voice low and firm, his eyes staring into the thug's. The leader let out a frustrated growl and tried to pull his arm away, but Davies twisted it slightly, making the man stumble back. The move was precise, controlled enough to stop him without using too much force. "Let him go!" one of the other thugs shouted, stepping forward to join the fight, encouraged by their leader's anger. The rest of the group started to close in, their movements planned and threatening. Davies changed his stance, his training kicking in. He released the leader's wrist and turned to face the group, his pose steady and strong. The tourists gasped as the scene got worse, some moving further back while others kept filming. "Stay where you are," Davies ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. But the warning was ignored. The skinny thug, the one who had seemed hesitant earlier, suddenly charged forward, throwing a wild punch at Davies's side. The guard sidestepped with practiced ease, his hand snapping up to block the blow before giving a sharp, controlled push to the man's shoulder. The thug stumbled back, almost losing his balance. Another thug, a stocky man with a shaved head, saw a chance and lunged at Davies from the other side. This time, Davies moved with lightning speed, turning on his heel to dodge the attack. He hooked his arm around the man's outstretched arm and twisted, forcing him to drop to his knees with a painful grunt. The leader, seeing his friends failing, let out a roar of frustration. "Get him!" he barked, and all three men rushed forward at once. The fight was fast and brutal. Davies stayed calm and composed, each move deliberate and efficient. He dodged one attacker, while blocking a second, his strikes precise enough to stop them without causing serious harm. His training as a royal guard was clear in every move. This was no show, but the skilled actions of a man trained to defend and protect. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their admiration for the guard growing with every second. The old war hero, though clearly shaken, stood his ground, his eyes wide as he watched the young soldier protect him with strong determination. Finally, the leader made one last, desperate try, charging at Davies with a wild swing, but Davies was ready. He caught the man's arm mid-swing and did a quick, controlled move that sent the leader falling to the ground. The man groaned, holding his shoulder as he tried to get up. Davies stepped forward, his presence towering over the fallen leader. "It's over," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Leave now, or face the consequences." The leader looked up at him, his confidence gone. He looked back at his friends who were nursing their own bruises and cuts, and realized they were beaten. With a muttered curse, he told the others to retreat. The group staggered away, their earlier confidence replaced by shame and defeat. Some tourists started to cheer softly, their applause getting louder as the thugs disappeared. Davies turned to the old soldier, his face softening. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, his tone respectful. The old man nodded, though his hand still shook slightly. "Thanks to you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Davies offered a small, reassuring smile. "You're safe now," he said. "That's all that matters." But even as the crowd started to leave and the tension in the air began to fade, Davies couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The way the leader had looked at him before leaving, it wasn't just anger, it was a promise of trouble yet to come. As the last sounds of the thugs' retreat faded, the courtyard began to hum, with activity again. The murmurs of the crowd filled the air, some voices shocked, others worried, and a few with disbelief. Tourists who had seen what happened huddled in small groups, talking excitedly as they replayed the moment they had just seen. Phones were still held up, recording the aftermath for those who would say this scene was too amazing to be real. Michael Davies, however, stood still, his pose still sharp, his disciplined stance unbroken. But his eyes checked the courtyard, looking for any lingering signs of trouble. His instincts told him that this event, dramatic as it was not the end. The old war hero, John Smith, leaned heavily on his stick, his breath still uneven. Davies looked at him, concern showing on his usually calm face. "Let's step out of the open, sir," Davies said, his voice low and steady. "You need a moment to rest." Smith hesitated, but then nodded, his pride giving way to practicality. Davies led him to a shaded area near the edge of the courtyard, where a stone bench offered some rest from the midday sun. Several people stepped aside, clearing a path for the pair. Some whispered words of admiration, others offered murmured thanks to Davies. But the guard ignored them, his focus only on the old soldier. "Here," Davies said, pointing to the bench. Smith sat down with a faint groan, his stick tapping softly against the stones. "Thank you," Smith said, his voice still shaky. I didn't think they'd—" His words faded. His, shaking hands moving to adjust the medals on his jacket. He looked down at them for a moment, as if checking that they were still there, still untouched. "They shouldn't have disrespected you like that," Davies said firmly, his tone carrying a bit of controlled anger. "Those medals show sacrifices most people can't even imagine." Smith looked up at him, his face showing thanks and tiredness. "And yet, there are always people who don't understand. People who only see the surface, not the stories. Behind them." Davies nodded. He had met such people before, those who saw tradition as just a show, who mocked what they didn't understand. But something about this group had felt different. Their aggression wasn't just from ignorance, it was deliberate, planned. Before Davies could say his thoughts, a voice interrupted them. "Excuse me, sir." Davies turned sharply, his hand moving towards his rifle. A young woman stood a few feet away, her phone still in her hand. She looked nervous, but determined. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said quickly, looking between Davies and Smith. "What you did back there, it was incredible. I've never seen a guard step in like that." Davies nodded slightly. "Thank you, miss," he replied, his tone polite but measured. He didn't stay on the praise, turning his attention back to Smith as the woman walked away. The crowd around them began to thin as tourists went back to exploring the palace grounds. But Davies's worry remained, a knot in his chest. The way the thugs had acted, their confidence, their refusal to back down, didn't feel right. They hadn't just been troublemakers. They had a purpose. "Sir," Davies said, his voice quieter now. "Do you know those men? Have you seen them before?" Smith shook his head, his brow furrowed. "No, I don't think so. But I got the feeling that they were after something more than just my medals." Davies frowned. "What do you mean?" Smith hesitated, his gaze distant as he looked for the right words. "They weren't just mocking me. They wanted something. I could see in their eyes. Greed, maybe, or something worse." Davies's jaw tightened. His instincts had been right. This wasn't just a random act of disrespect. There was something more to it, something he couldn't ignore. Before he could ask more, another voice called out, "Guard, over here!" Davies turned to see one of his fellow guards coming, his face urgent. The man stopped a few steps away and saluted quickly. "Captain Jones wants to see you immediately," the guard said, his gaze flickering briefly too. Smith, then back to Davies. "It's about the fight." Davies straightened his pose, snapping into perfection. "Understood." Smith looked up at him, worry etched into his lined face. "They're going to tell you off, aren't they?" Smith asked, concern clear in his voice. Davies didn't answer straight away. He met Smith's gaze, his expression hard to read. Finally he said, "Rules are strict for a reason, but some situations need us to act." Smith's hand tightened on his stick. "And if they don't understand that, they will," Davies said simply, his voice steady. "Or they won't. Either way, I'd do the same again." The old soldier nodded slowly, admiration softening his features. "You're a good man, son." Davies nodded slightly, a gesture of respect, before turning to follow his fellow guard towards the captain's office. But as he walked away, his thoughts stayed with Smith, and with the lingering threat that hadn't fully shown itself yet. The air in Captain Jones's office was heavy with formality. The walls were lined with historical items, portraits of past guards, and awards for bravery, all showing the institution's history. Michael Davies stood straight in the center of the room, his pose perfect, though a faint tension tightened his jaw. Across the desk, Captain Jones, a woman with sharp features and a strong presence, studied him with a careful look. "You broke formation," she began, her voice steady but firm. "Left your post without clear orders. Do you understand how serious your actions are, Guard Davies?" "Yes, ma'am," Davies replied, his voice unwavering. "I do." Jones's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something behind her eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or something close to respect. She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands neatly on the desk. "Explain yourself." Davies took a deep breath, his words carefully chosen. An elderly civilian, a war hero, was being bullied by a group of men. The situation got worse, to physical violence. He was in immediate danger. I acted to protect him. "And in doing so, you broke the rules," Jones countered. "The rules are there to keep order, Guard Davies. They are not suggestions." "I understand that, ma'am," Davies said evenly. "But I also understand that the job of a Royal Guard is more than just show. It's about protection, honor, duty. In that moment, following the rules would have meant standing by while a defenseless man was attacked. That was a choice I could not make." The room fell silent. Jones's sharp gaze stayed on Davies, her fingers tapping softly against the desk. Finally she spoke, her tone softer but no less firm. "Your actions, while good in intent, have put us in a difficult position. The event was seen by dozens of people, many of whom recorded it. The video is already spreading online." Davies's brow furrowed slightly, though he stayed silent. "Public opinion is a delicate thing," Jones continued. "The Royal Guard is seen as a symbol of tradition and discipline. Breaking the rules, even for the right reasons, risks damaging that image." Davies's stomach tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Respectfully, ma'am, I believe that upholding those values needs action, not inaction." Jones looked at him for a long moment before sighing. "You'll be placed under review. During this time, your actions will be looked at, and a decision will be made about any formal punishment. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Davies said, his tone resolute. Jones nodded, her expression softening just slightly. "That will be all for now." Davies saluted crisply and turned to leave, his boots clicking softly against the polished floor. But as he reached the door, Jones's voice stopped him. "Guard Davies?" He turned, meeting her gaze. "For what it's worth," she said, her tone quieter, "I would have made the same choice." Davies allowed himself a small nod before leaving the office. The weight of the reprimand stayed, but so did the belief that he had done the right thing. Back in the courtyard, the crowds had thinned, but a few onlookers still lingered, talking about the earlier fight. John Smith sat on the same bench where Davies had left him, his posture slightly more relaxed now that the immediate danger had passed. When Davies approached, Smith looked up, his lined face breaking into a weary smile. "Back already?" he asked, his tone tinged with humour. "Thought they might throw the book at you." "Not yet," Davies replied with a faint smirk. "Still under review." Smith's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet thanks. "You shouldn't be punished for doing what's right," he said. "What you did back there, it wasn't just brave, it was honourable." Davies shook his head slightly. "I just did my duty, sir." "No," Smith said firmly, leaning forward on his stick. "You did more than that. You stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves. That's what true service looks like." For a moment, the two men sat in silence, the weight of the day settling between them. Davies glanced down at the old soldiers' medals, their polished surfaces catching the light. "Those medals," he said quietly. "They mean something. I wasn't about to let them take that away from you." Smith's hand moved to the largest medal on his chest, his fingers brushing it gently. These medals," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "represent the men I fought beside, the ones who didn't make it home. I carry their memory with me every day. That's why I can't let anyone take them. Not because of their value, but because of what they stand for." Davies nodded, his respect for the old soldier deepening. "And that's why I couldn't stand by." The following day, news broke that the men who had attacked Smith had been found and arrested. Local police, with the help of witnesses and security camera footage from the palace grounds, had tracked the group down. It was revealed that the thugs were part of a small-time criminal gang, targeting weak people for quick money or valuables. Their plan to scare and steal from Smith had failed badly, thanks to Davies's action. When Smith heard the news, he immediately called the palace to thank Davies. The guard, however, remained typically humble. "I was just doing my job," he told Smith. But the old soldier's voice was firm. "No, son, you were doing much more than that." The courtyard buzzed with quiet excitement. Rows of chairs had been arranged in a half-circle, facing a temporary platform decorated with the Royal Guard's emblem. Tourists mixed with important people, journalists and palace staff, their voices hushed as they waited for the ceremony to start. Cameras clicked, capturing the important moment. Michael Davies stood off to the side in full uniform, his polished boots shining in the afternoon sun. His posture was perfect, as always, but a flicker of unease crossed his face. This was not the type of attention he was used to. His duties were meant to be done in the background, away from the spotlight. Yet today, he was at the center of it. At exactly noon, Captain Jones stepped onto the platform, her commanding presence immediately silencing the murmurs of the crowd. She approached the podium, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming here today," she began, we are here to recognize an amazing act of courage and honor, one that shows the true spirit of the Royal Guard." The crowd listened carefully as Jones told the story of that day. She spoke of the old war hero, John Smith, and the unprovoked attack he had suffered. She described Davies's decision to step in, despite the strict rules that bound him. Guard Davies's actions remind us that while tradition and discipline are the foundations of our institution, there are moments when doing what is right must come first. She said, "He protected a man who had dedicated his life to serving this country. For that, we owe him our thanks." Jones gestured for Davies to step forward. The guard moved with precise, measured steps, his expression serious as he went up onto the platform. The crowd burst into applause, a few cheers breaking through the formality. Davies paused in front of Jones, standing straight as she pinned a medal onto his uniform, a shiny silver emblem showing outstanding behavior. "Guard Michael Davies," Jones said, her tone softening slightly. "Your bravery and commitment to justice have brought great honor to this institution. We thank you for your service." Davies bowed his head slightly, his voice steady as he replied, "Thank you, Ma'am." Jones wasn't finished. She turned her attention to the front row, where John Smith sat with his stick resting against his knee. His jacket was perfect, his medals polished to a shine. Despite his age, he held himself with the quiet dignity of a soldier who had seen and suffered much. "Mr. John Smith," Jones said, addressing him directly, "your service to this country spans many years, and your strength in the face of trouble is a testament to your character. Today we honor not just your past sacrifices, but your strength and determination in the present." The crowd rose to their feet as Smith was invited onto the stage. The old soldier moved slowly but steadily, supported by his stick. When he reached the podium, Jones pinned a new medal onto his jacket, a token of recognition for his bravery during the event. Smith's voice trembled slightly as he addressed the audience. "I never expected to find myself in another battle at this age," he said, his tone both light-hearted and thoughtful. "But thanks to Guard Davies, I'm reminded that courage and honor are values we carry with us for life." He turned to Davies, his voice growing steadier. "You didn't just protect me that day. You reminded me, and everyone here, that there are still people who stand up for what's right. For that, I thank you." Davies nodded, his respect for the old soldier clear in his expression. After the ceremony, the courtyard was alive with chatter as people gathered around the stage. Davies and Smith stood together, surrounded by well-wishers, shaking hands and receiving congratulations. "You'll be back at your post tomorrow, I imagine," Smith said with a faint smile, leaning on his stick as they spoke. Davies nodded. "That's the job, sir. Standing watch, being ready. It's not always about action. It's about being there when it matters." Smith's expression softened. "And you were there when it mattered most. I won't forget that." They shook hands, the gesture firm and full of mutual respect. Smith tipped his hat slightly, a small, old-fashioned gesture that carried a huge weight of thanks. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the courtyard in a warm, golden glow, Davies returned to his post at the palace gates. He stood tall and determined, his medal shining on his uniform. Tourists passed by, taking photos, not knowing the drama that had happened just days before. Far in the distance, Smith walked down the stone path, his medals catching the last rays of sunlight. Though his steps were slow, his spirit was unbroken, his faith in honor and justice renewed. For Davies, this moment was a reminder of why he served, not just to keep tradition, but to protect and defend when it mattered most. As the clock struck the hour, he started his watch again, with a renewed sense of pride, a visible symbol of discipline, courage, and unwavering duty. And that's the story of how a Royal Guard's bravery turned a moment of disrespect into a lesson in honor and justice. What do you think about Michael Davies's decision to break the rules to protect the old soldier? Would you have done the same in his position? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes standing up for what's right is the greatest act of bravery.